Now, in my previous video, I walked through the lessons and principles derived from my cholesterol journey and by switching to a plant-based diet. But that's just my experience. And people might rightly say, what works for you may not work for me. Now, fair enough. And so in this video, I want to broaden my analysis from just my experience to the broader food culture and eating habits across Singapore and Southeast Asia in general. I'm going to walk you through a few key data points before drawing what I consider to be a pretty conservative conclusion. Ready? Now, the first claim I want to make is that our medical system is only built to fix problems, and it cannot give us a compelling vision of what good health should look like. Now, let me illustrate this with two different examples. So I play soccer with this friend of mine. He's in his 60s, and each time after we play, he says that his knee will ache and feel painful for a few days or sometimes even an entire week after. And so he went to see an orthopedic doctor to ask for advice. Now, he wasn't suffering from any ligament tear or bone injury. He just wanted preventative advice so that his condition wouldn't worsen. And guess what the doctor told him? The doctor said, sorry, you're not sick, so I can't treat you. And with that, the doctor discharged him and gave him an open date to return when he has an actual problem. Got it? That's example number one as to why our medical system only fixes problems and doesn't help with prevention or a holistic view of health. Example number two. Now, I've spoken to several doctors while my cholesterol was relatively high, and I've asked them whether going fully plant-based would help. I've also asked doctors whether they believe a plant-based diet can cure autoimmune illnesses, which a relative of mine suffers from. And generally, the advice that they give is quite similar. It could help, but there's no real proof. There's no real evidence, and therefore it's better to stick to the tried and tested route of Western medication. Now, the key thing to understand here is that our medical system is built on the basis of diagnosis and treatment. So when you go to a doctor, they do tests to obtain a diagnosis, and then they propose a treatment based on that diagnosis. But the reality is that health is not necessarily a binary thing. It's not as though I'm sick or I'm not sick. But for many health conditions, it's more like a spectrum. And so, if you are generally healthy, the doctor will simply not be able to help you because they are not trained in taking a holistic view of health. Now, this is demonstrated most clearly when I spoke to a doctor friend of mine who works in internal medicine, which deals with conditions relating to high cholesterol, high blood, high sugar, and obesity. So he says that most of his peers, other fellow doctors, understand that diet plays a massive role in our health, but there's nothing they can do to change the eating trends. What they can do is to treat the symptoms of that issue, that is, the patients that come to them. Right? Because it's much easier to prescribe a pill than to even remotely suggest that a person should consider changing their diet. People want quick fixes. They don't want to give up their depraved longings and lip-smacking mala satisfaction. And I think that's something that most of us can sort of understand and relate to. Now, this anecdote is very, very telling because it shows us the massive gap between our medical system and what I call the unshakable stronghold of our stubborn appetites. I want to eat whatever I want and nobody has the right to tell me otherwise. Even if my cholesterol is high, at most I cut down fried foods to once a week, but nobody has the right to warn or tell me what I should do, much less suggest something as ridiculous as going plant-based. Now, here's another data point that shows you how much power our appetites have over us. So, some plant-based or vegan restaurants have tried to create mock meat using plant-based ingredients, which indicates that they want to compete in taste with normal restaurants, but in a healthier way. But these typically fail spectacularly because the taste just doesn't cut it, and people want the original taste of meat. They don't care if it's unhealthy. So as an example, a vegan burger joint called Veganburg recently closed their outlet at Woodleigh Mall after slightly more than a year in operation. You get the point. Taste is all that matters, and if you can't compete on taste, nobody's going to eat your food. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to understand the massive hold that our appetites have over us, which, in Christian terms, is considered an idol that most Christians aren't even aware of. It's not an idol in the same sense of like a depraved craving or an addiction to drugs, but it's an idol that has been normalized and made palatable. So to recap, our medical system is only built to fix problems, and it cannot give us a compelling vision of what good health could look like. Now, in addition, our appetites are so depraved that most of us find it near to impossible to give up meat or whatever ultra-processed foods that we eat on a regular basis, much less talk about anything remotely near to a plant-based diet. So what's the alternative and what's the way forward? Now, when we want to propose a vision for health and the good life, such a vision cannot be negatively constructed. For example, I want to not get cancer or a stroke. Like, what kind of a vision is that? But instead, it needs to be positively articulated. So for example, I want to be able to run a marathon when I'm 70. However, when it comes to food, it's very difficult to articulate such a vision clearly because we're talking about human life that is going to last for decades, and there are many factors in play other than food. So it's not as simple as asking your kid to finish his homework by 5 o'clock. So instead, it's better to articulate a vision that is anchored on principles rather than chasing or pursuing a specific outcome. So for example, my personal vision will be that I'm not strictly vegan, but I'm heavily plant-based as far as is possible, and whenever there is a choice between plant-based and animal, I will choose plants. Now this is a principle-based vision, right? Because I don't know whether or not I may get a stroke when I turn 70 years old, so I don't articulate my vision in those terms. So loosely speaking, that's my vision, and I will detail in another video exactly what I eat on a day-to-day basis. But for now, let me share with you a couple of ideas that have really helped me move away from meat to such a plant-based vision. So there's a book called Good Energy, which is written by a doctor in the US called Dr. Casey Means. And in it, she explains that all the different cells in our body need energy to function, and that energy is derived from the food that we consume. So if we eat nutrient-dense food, our cells have what she calls good energy. And if we eat ultra-processed or unhealthy foods, we feed our cells what she calls bad energy. And our cells won't have the energy it needs to function well. Now over time, this bad energy accumulates, which leads to disease in the tissues or organs that those cells belong to. So for example, if a cell in my brain keeps being fed bad energy, it can lead to a problem with my brain, and if a cell in my lung doesn't get the right energy, it could lead to a problem with my lung. So the claim that she's making is this: the food that we eat doesn't just contribute to a specific illness in a specific part of our body, but it can cause illness to any or all parts of our body, meaning what we eat really matters. So in short, she calls this metabolic dysfunction, and she views it as a widespread systemic problem rooted in cell-level energy failure, a failure that eating poorly contributes toward. Now this is quite revolutionary because traditional Western medicine is organized around specialties: heart doctor, brain doctor, so on and so forth. But Dr. Means is making a claim that all modern chronic disease is a failure of cellular energy metabolism, which collapses the walls between medical specialties. It prioritizes prevention rather than cure, and it empowers lifestyle rather than straightforward prescriptions. Now what Dr. Means has said here may or may not be completely true, but I certainly find it very compelling. And once we understand this, our approach when we, for example, get a high blood or high cholesterol diagnosis will change immediately. You see, doctors are only trained to prescribe medication to solve a medical condition. And as a result, they fail to have a holistic view of how diet affects health from a data-driven perspective, for example, my cholesterol journey. You know, many of us go to our GP for high blood and high cholesterol, and the doctor typically prescribes a pill a day to manage that, and we think that that is normal. But if the doctor does that without first explaining or trying to persuade you to go plant-based, I consider that a deeply irresponsible thing to do. Doctors are trained to do this, so I understand why they do what they do. But that does not make it acceptable or responsible. Because a doctor should ultimately be caring for your health in a holistic manner, rather than simply doing what he has been trained to do. And hopefully you can sort of understand where I'm coming from, because this isn't rocket science and I am not medically trained. It's pretty common sense. But in our medical system, with all its subdivisions and specialties, sense is not always common. Now let me summarize the key things I've said thus far, add a few more data points, and then conclude. Let me start first with the Bible, sort of a high-level starting point before going into the actual data we gather from science and longevity studies. So point number 1, the original ideal that is laid down in the Bible is only grass for food. Animals were a concession only after the great flood in the story of Noah and his ark. And this suggests that plant-based was the original ideal and the way to go. If you want more details on this, you may refer to my previous video in the description box below. Now point number 2, the young onset cancer rates, which means for people under the age of 50, are on the rise and rapidly so. Now among the 14 cancer types that are on the rise, 8 of them are related to the digestive system. Now this is also related to other factors such as microplastics, but certainly what we can say is that diet is probably a big factor here. Now point number 3, there was a survey done by Southeast Asia Stats that shows Singapore's obesity rate is around 11%, which is lower than Malaysia, which is at 20%, but much higher than Vietnam at just 2%. Now think about the average meal in each of these countries. Maybe chicken rice for Singapore, nasi lemak for Malaysia, and maybe a bowl of pho for Vietnam. Now why do you think these stats are the way they are? Think about the amount of fried food, the amount of vegetables in each of these meals. So the point is that we can't just follow our culture blindly, right? See, if you live in Vietnam, you can just sort of just eat the average diet and you probably end up pretty healthy. But that's not the case in Singapore or Malaysia, right? Instead, we have to discern the state of our culture and then decide if we want to go along or form our own counter-cultural decisions. You know, many old people think that stroke and heart disease is a natural part of life. 生老病死. It is not. And we know that by looking at the health data of the other countries around us. And this is what we call cultural plausibility, which means that what we consider acceptable and normal is deeply influenced by the cultures that we live in and we are exposed to. So if you live in Singapore, you think that chronic disease is a norm. But once you look at areas such as the blue zone, you'll find that this isn't true at all. Point number 4. The Blue Zones research done by Dan Buettner discovered that a plant-based diet is one of the common contributing factors to many of the areas in the world where people lived the longest. Now point number 5, which I've already summarized here, is our medical system is only built to fix problems after they show up. And it cannot give us a picture of what vibrant health could look like. Last point, point number 6. There exists some niche communities who advocate plant-based diets that have negated and in some cases even cured individuals of their own autoimmune illnesses or even cancer conditions. Now these may include raw veg diets, and one such example is Dr. Brooke Goldner. Now, taken as a whole, if we consider all these 6 points, I think it's reasonable to conclude that while we don't necessarily need to all go vegan, we should certainly get as close to plant-based as possible. And now, let me conclude. So recently, the Health Promotion Board in Singapore introduced a Nutri-Grade grading system, which looks at saturated fat and sugar content in drinks such as bubble tea or kopi. So each drink will get a rating. A is the healthiest, D is the least healthy. And this is quite a wonderful thing. I imagine that the bubble tea businesses immediately shrank by half immediately after this was launched because All these companies have to actually put the label with the letter A, B, C, or D on top of their menus, right? So people can make informed decisions. But you see, even this is still woefully inadequate within the bigger scheme of things that I've described today. See, what we need is not just to make healthier food choices, but to develop new loves, new desires, new appetites. And here I go into character or spiritual formation, because the way we form these new desires and appetites is to formulate a vision, a picture of what good health looks like, and then to care deeply for our bodies, to reconfigure and nurture the eating habits required to sustain such a vision. Now, a word to Christians. In general, Christians care very much about morality, doing the right versus doing the wrong thing. And for the most part, morality tends to be quite black and white. For example, murder or adultery. However, one of the ways that the devil works is by taking black and white and turning that into grey. So much so that the choice is no longer clear, and rather than a right or wrong thing, it becomes a spectrum of choices. You might say different shades of grey. Now, this is precisely what has happened when it comes to food. Food, which is a good thing, has become all about what I want to eat in such a way that is so normalized that Christians don't even think about it. We think very carefully when our actions affect another person, but have we thought deeply about how our food choices affect our very own bodies? If the body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, shouldn't we steward it with great care and to the best of our knowledge? Is eating purely a physical activity, or is it ultimately a spiritual activity as well? And may I suggest to Christians, with reverence, that if you are eating what I call the average Singaporean diet, you may very well be neglecting, or even worse, desecrating your body without even being aware of it at all. So let me invite you to seek the way of life and not the way of death. And unfortunately, just as it is with following Jesus, the way of life when it comes to food is also very, very narrow. And we should not be surprised. So that's all I have for today, and in my next video, I walk through in detail what I eat on a daily basis. Thank you. I hope that this has been helpful, and if you've enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.